From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Singapore has a long-standing reputation as a clean and green city. It is also known as the Garden City. But did you know things were completely different back in the 1960s? People were crammed in overcrowded and unsanitary living spaces and public areas, allowing diseases and pollution to spread easily. A pioneer civil servant, Lee Ek Tieng, stepped up to implement major reforms to improve Singapore's environment. Today, we speak to Samantha Bow and Matthew Gunn, co-writers of the new book Lee Ek Tieng, the Green General of Lee Kuan Yew. We discuss how this Green General marshaled resources to clean up Singapore and set new standards for the city we now live in. Okay, thanks very much, Sam and Matt, for joining me today. To start off, let's look a bit at the story of Lee Ek Tieng. Now, it was covered in Nutgraff's previous book, The Last Fools, The Eight Immortals of Lee Kuan Yew. What motivated you to look deeper into the life and career of Lee Ek Tieng in this new book?
Thanks, Dev. So The Last Fools, that chapter on Mr. Lee Ek Tieng focused largely on the cleaning of the Singapore River, because the point of that book was to focus on each individual's key achievement. And for Mr. Lee Ek Tieng, that was the most known. So sometime in 2022, actually, some of his former colleagues approached us. They had read the book, and these were people from the anti-pollution unit. And they came to our office, met up with us, had a chat, and they said, we really want to have about Mr. Lee and how he kept air pollution at bay. But very quickly, the conversation evolved into writing a book about his life. Because quite simply, we realized that there was just so much more to tell. He was heavily involved in many aspects of the transformation of Singapore's environment. It ranged from modernizing our public sanitation system, improving garbage disposal, of course, cleaning the river, kickstarting the development of new water, and eventually even giving it the catchy name that it has, New Water. And it made us realize that there were a lot of things in the environment that we took for granted that could be traced back to him. So just in our homes, we look in our homes, you have flushing toilets, you have clean water running in our taps, and that can be traced back to him. So we realized that, of course, it was a no-brainer. We should write a book about him, and a more comprehensive one. So that's how Lee Ek Tieng, the Green General of Lee Kuan Yew, came about.
Given that Lee Ek Tieng was too unwell to be interviewed by then, what was your research process like, and what would you say is the most interesting detail you uncovered?
Yeah, so that was probably the most challenging part of the project, right? We can't speak to the man that we're writing about. So our research had to be done mainly through sources like newspaper articles and other publications by like the Ministry of Environment, things like that. But Mr. Lee was also quite a private person. He shied away from the spotlight, so there wasn't much out there about him. Googling him didn't bring out much, and finding his name in newspapers was also very rare. So every time we found like a nugget of information about him somewhere, it was like striking gold. But the real gold mine was his oral history interviews that he did with the National Archives. So those interviews were sort of the only way we could hear from him directly. And the information there was actually very helpful. Things about his early life down to his time as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Environment. So we dug through all those different records. Besides that, we also got to interview Mr. Lee Ek Tieng's family and some ex-colleagues also. So I think we did over 40 interviews with different people, right? So the book committee who approached us to write the book, they had lots of connections, lots of their friends, people who had worked with Mr. Lee before. They all gave us valuable insight into both the work Mr. Lee did, but also the kind of man he was. So their stories formed the bulk of our content as we tried to tell Mr. Lee's story through the eyes of those around him. I think what really surprised us was that all these people were so willing to speak to us about him, considering that a lot of them were his juniors. So imagine being so happy to talk about your boss and even write this book about him. Mr. Lee's sons also very helpful, told us about his family life and provided some really good photos also for the book. Yeah, so I think through all this research, we slowly pieced together the story of who Mr. Lee was, the work he did, and the contributions he made for Singapore. I think the most interesting detail for me was a story of how Mr. Lee, when he was a young boy, actually escaped the hospital. Right? So he had a minor operation at Singapore General Hospital, and then the next morning he simply got up and left with nothing but his pajamas on him. Somehow he managed to get home after hitching a ride from a trishaw rider, and it's quite a story because here's a young boy and he just wanted to get home, so he took the easiest route. He just got up and left, and it actually shows how committed Lee was to doing what he wanted and how straightforward he was. And I think that's part of what made him so successful and helped him accomplish so much in his career later on.
Yeah. For me, I think the most interesting part was how Mr. Lee was like outside of work. So we found a lot of interesting stories about him through the interviews with family and friends. So we realized that he was a real handyman. So in his home, there was actually a workbench, much like the kind you have in science labs. And that was where he would tinker with things, build things. One example, the cutest example we have would be how he built a toy sword complete with a Zorro outfit because his son was going for a costume party. And several of his colleagues told us that he built his own stereo. And his former PA told us that her cousin once walked past Mr. Lee's house and saw Mr. Lee on the roof. He was fixing the roof. So he was a real handyman and he was a real engineer through and through. And I think that really stayed with me after all the interviews.
Now, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew wrote, quote, "There would have been no clean and green Singapore without Lee Ek Tieng," unquote. Now, Lee Ek Tieng is perhaps best known for leading the effort to clean up the Singapore River in the 1970s and 1980s. How did he get this monumental task done?
Anyone who knows how the Singapore River and perhaps the country's waterways were like in the 1970s will know that cleaning them up was a near impossible task. I didn't personally experience or see, how it was, but I've heard stories of how they would smell the river before they could see it. But Mr. Lee Ek Tieng would tell the Straits Times many years later, the PM says do it, we have to do it. But the question is, how did they get it done? And the answer is just very systematically. So they started off by first identifying all the sources of pollution. So there were tons of people using the Singapore River. There were like squatters, pig farmers, bumboat operators, street hawkers. And because there was no proper sanitation, all their waste, dirty water, anything would just flow into the Singapore River. And that's what made it so filthy. So their solution was if you wanted to eliminate all these sources of pollution, you need to move them away. And the only way people would move, especially from a place that they were so used to, is that you need to give them alternatives. But it cannot just be any alternative. It had to be a better alternative. So one example would be for the squatters. To encourage them to shift out, Mr. Lee and his team worked with HDB to build homes for them. And the HDB would do it at breakneck speed. So at the height of this building frenzy, a flat was built every 36 minutes. That was how quick. And it was a real upgrade for these people. You are moving into a flat, and that would mean modern sanitation, clean running water, proper rubbish disposal, and of course, proper protection from the elements. So eventually, many of them moved without much complaints. And another famous example would be the street hawkers. So they were used to operating on roadsides and rubbish, dirty water, everything flow into the drains and they will clog up and pollute Singapore's waterways. So the solution was actually hawker centers. They were built and they were provided, these illegal street hawkers were provided with proper stalls, tap water, electricity, and so on. And we realized in our research that this issue with illegal street hawkers predates Mr. Lee. It was an issue that even the British were struggling with. They tried to license them, but they failed. So it was a very difficult issue to deal with. But in Mr. Lee's time, they managed to solve it. But of course, the building of the hawker centers took time. So in the interim, they still continue to try to license the hawkers. At least they knew who they were. And they moved them into interim hawker centers or in the back lanes, because when they were at the front lanes, they will actually block traffic and it will make it, quite difficult for people to move around. And of course, lots of enforcement, because they will, because these are people and then they are trying to make money. So of course, if they realize that, okay, business not very good at the back lane, they will just move in front. And if one goes, everyone will go because you don't want to lose out. So that were the issues. So every day, the enforcement officers who are from the environment ministries will go there and will catch these people and ensure that, the hawkers will not flout the rules. So it was really, I would say at the end of the day, it was really multiple government agencies working together and pulling towards a common goal. And Mr. Lee Ek Tieng was the one orchestrating the entire operation.
It's interesting that we are discussing the Singapore River, and now if we go beyond the river to the whole island, before the 1970s, so Singapore mostly operated a manual waste collection system using night soil buckets. Why did Lee Ek Tieng consider changing this a top priority upon becoming the Permanent Secretary for Environment in 1972?
The process of clearing waste via the night soil bucket system was a very messy one. The night soil workers would have to come around the back alleys, stick their hands into toilets, grab the used buckets, pull them out, and then you will replace them with an empty one. So these used buckets can be very full. So when you're carrying them from the toilets to the what they call honey carts, with all the different doors, and then they will then be transported to a disposal center. It was not uncommon for the waste to spill onto the ground. And this would result in, of course, the spread of diseases. And we also all know how extremely smelly human waste is. And another issue is that, yes, because of the smell, there were a lot of children or anyone who could not handle the smell. They would choose to, in fact, just do their business straight into drains. So there were a lot of environmental issues associated with the system. And being heavily reliant on human effort, the entire system could fall apart if the night soil workers decide to go on strike. So you can just imagine the state of the country if that were to happen. So as Permanent Secretary of the Environment Ministry, it was Mr. Lee Ek Tieng's job to improve Singapore's environment. And so the night soil bucket system had to go. And it had to be replaced, of course, with something. And his team, they went about developing a modern public sanitation system. And what this meant is that you had to build a network of underground sewers, you had to build sewage treatment plants, and you cannot just build them as and when and anywhere you wanted. So that's where the sewerage master plan that Mr. Lee developed prior to this, I think that was in 1969, that really helped because it provided a blueprint. So it ensured that you had a look on, okay, where are all these things? And whenever a new housing estate came up, they would then add to this system to make sure that the system is ready for all the people that were going to move in. So that is really why, in fact, the night soil bucket system, in a way, it worked fine. But because of all these environmental issues associated with this, and as a developing country, it had to go. And that was why he made it a priority.
Now, one new thing I learned from reading the book is that Singapore opened the first waste incineration plant in Asia outside Japan in 1979. Given that we were not yet a wealthy country at the time, why did Singapore invest considerable resources into this project which Mr. Lee Ek Tieng led?
You are quite right to say that we were not a wealthy country. So that 100 million, there you can imagine there were lots of other government agencies who would be keen to have that budget. Education ministry to develop the curriculum, develop schools. But the problem was that Singapore had no choice. Because being a tiny island, it was running out of space for dumping grounds. So that was the time when they were not called landfills, they were called dumping grounds because there was no burning. So that was the technical difference that the Environment Ministry folks told me. So the dumping grounds, the existing ones were filling up very fast because of rapid population growth. And they were cracking their heads, where is the next dumping ground going to be? So the government knew that it had to think of a long-term solution. You can't just keep finding new spaces to dump, especially when you need these empty spaces for new flats. That was more important. So that's when they considered incineration. In fact, even before Mr. Lee made it something that Singapore, pushed through with the building of an incineration plant, it was talked about. But I think, as you rightly mentioned, the price tag was definitely a deterrent. So at this point, because there was really no more space, they decided, okay, we will test this out. We were going to study it because this is a technology that was being used in Europe and Japan. And they found out that it could reduce the volume of rubbish by up to 90%. So at that point, it was the best solution. So the team went on study trips to incineration plants in countries like Switzerland, Germany, and Japan, and they came back convinced. So being the very trusty, hardworking civil servants they came out, quickly thumbed out a report and then sent it up, and it got approved. And that's how they got the 100 million to build an incineration plant. And clearly, it proved to be a good solution. And several more incineration plants would be built across the years. But of course, it wasn't a perfect solution because, it reduced by 90%. So there's still that 10% of rubbish in the form of incinerated ash that had to be landfilled. And that's what is being dumped at Pulau Semakau right now. And it is a problem that current government continues to grapple with because you still need space, but you can imagine if we did not have incineration plants, how much worse the situation would be. And I don't think we need to go look far to imagine how it'd be like because there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that continue to have dumping grounds. And of course, it's an environmental issue. You have heaps of it, and the environment folks told me that it can even catch fire. So that's something that we have managed to avoid with going down the incineration route.
Long before contact tracing during COVID, Lee Ek Tieng introduced case tracing to track a different kind of threat, which is malaria. Now, what were the various strategies he used to finally free Singapore of this disease by 1982?
Yeah, so in fighting malaria, Mr. Lee Ek Tieng had quite a battle plan. Right? Case tracing was one of his so-called more defensive strategies, right? Because malaria is a vector-borne disease, which means that mosquitoes become carriers of the virus when they bite people with malaria, and then they spread it when they bite the next person. Right? So long before you had safe entry, trace together, and things like that, Mr. Lee came up with this case tracing, which involved isolating confirmed malaria cases in the hospital and then tracing where they lived or visited before they got the disease. Right? So that helped to identify places where these malaria-carrying mosquitoes were. So that was his defensive strategy. And then came the offensive tactics. Right? So in the Ministry of Environment building, there was a sort of a war room with a huge board on the wall. Right? The board had a map of the whole of Singapore. Right? And on that map, there were little red magnets marking all the different mosquito hotspots. So how they got this information was one is from case tracing. So the epidemiology department in the Ministry of Health who handled this case tracing would pass on information on all these mosquito hotspots. Even residents would also call in to pass on this information. So Mr. Lee really like the Green General. He would send out his soldiers, the public health inspectors, to these spots to clear them of mosquitoes. So what they would do was clear drains and puddles, oil the drains as well so that mosquitoes who had laid eggs in the drains couldn't hatch. And they would also do house visits in high-risk areas, which is something that we still see some here and there today. And there was also a schedule for these inspectors to go out 6 days a week to clear mosquitoes. Right? So what they did was divide Singapore into 6 sectors, and every day inspectors would go to one sector to check that sector, to clear the sector of different puddles and whatnot. And the most challenging areas were the hilly areas around Singapore. Right, but the officers, of course, couldn't be everywhere every day. So the department in charge of mosquito control, they actually developed a device called the OV trap. So it's a very unassuming black cylinder. And what it does is it attracts mosquitoes to lay their eggs inside it. But after the eggs hatch, the adult mosquitoes will not be able to escape the OV trap. So that sort of attracts the mosquitoes and allows the public health inspectors to leave the area unattended for a while to catch the mosquitoes there. So Mr. Lee, being the engineer he before they rolled it out, he took the device back home and tested it all around his house. And his sons told us that they would often see all these traps around the house. And Mr. Lee Ek Tieng wanted to sort of see what sort of mosquitoes there were around his house as well. So eventually the OB trap was rolled out. It became sort of the unmanned combat division, if you like, and it helped to catch mosquitoes when the public health inspectors weren't around. So today also you see very similar mosquito traps, I think based on the OB trap all around Singapore. Right? So there were all these different strategies that Mr. Lee Ek Tieng employed. And it was quite the battle because malaria was still quite prevalent at the time. And there was a number of outbreaks here and there that sort of set their progress back. But Mr. Lee persevered with his plan. And even after clearing Singapore of malaria in 1982, of course, that wasn't job done because there were still diseases like dengue and Zika that were slowly becoming more prevalent. So the war room stayed in operation, the wall map stayed up, the red magnet stayed there, and the public health inspectors continued to go out to the 6 sectors 6 days a week, leaving the traps and clearing Singapore of as many mosquito hotspots as possible.
Now, when we talk about the environment, we tend to think about its effect on the living. But in Lee Ek Tieng's case, he also had to deal with the dead via the closure and clearing of Singapore's cemeteries from the 1970s onwards. How did he handle this sensitive issue and what was the public reaction?
Yeah, so it's not a pleasant thing to have to do, of course, to clear cemeteries and to ask people to dig up their late relatives. But it was quite a important thing to do then because Singapore, of course, has always been a land scarce country. At the time, especially, there was a lot of undeveloped land and Singapore's population was growing. And so a lot of this land had to be used for development. So in the 1970s, cemeteries were identified as land that could be developed. And the public reaction was what you'd expect. I think we see it nowadays too. People don't want to give up their land and people don't want to exhume their late relatives. The biggest uproar came from the Chinese community because they own the most cemeteries around Singapore. These cemeteries were owned by these Chinese clan associations, and they actually wrote many letters in to try and stop the closing of the cemeteries. But you have to understand that at the time there was really no choice. Right? Lots of land was covered by cemeteries. Just think of modern day Bishan. About 2/3 of today's Bishan was a cemetery. Right? And you look at it today and you see how many people stay there now. So it's really necessary. If not, the living would have no place to stay. Right? So the dead had to make way. So what Mr. Lee did was to employ funerary middlemen. These people were knowledgeable in death rights and were well respected in their various religious communities. So through them, they assured the communities and educated them on alternative death rights besides burial. The government also offered subsidies for exhumation. So exhumation costs would come up to about $200 then, which was a lot of money back then. But the government would subsidize that. And of course, cremation was mooted as the main end of life right instead of burial. Different columbariums were built also to keep up with the growing demand for cremation. Of course, there were also provisions made, especially to smaller religious groups who were completely against cremation. Groups like the Muslims, Jews, the Parsis, and the Zoroastrian Persians. Right, so these groups were also given plots of land in Choa Chu Kang Cemetery, owned by the government, for burial. In fact, actually, the Chinese, Hindus, and Christians were also given plots of land for burial, for those of them who weren't keen on cremation. Right? So despite the necessity, of course, to free up land by closing cemeteries, there was still a balance to how things were done. Consideration was still given to these different religious groups, and land was still given to them to do burial instead of cremation. So it was quite a large operation. Of course, it involved different ministries, but driving it was the Ministry of Environment, and they were also in charge of managing the cemeteries, especially the Choa Chu Kang Cemetery. Right, there's a story when I think a ship capsized in the middle of the night, and they had to bury people in the middle of the night. So they worked late at night to open up the cemetery and to make sure that all of the end of life rites could be done in a timely manner. Right? So despite the public reaction, I think Mr. Lee made the effort to ensure that everyone was accounted for, everyone was considered.
Finally, the book describes Lee Ek Tieng as a humble leader who gave his staff considerable autonomy to do their work. Would you say this was the secret of success behind a man who wore so many hats? And what can Singaporeans take away from his example in understanding how pioneer leaders worked?
Yeah, so I think Mr. Lee, what stuck out to me was that Mr. Lee was someone who knew himself well. He knew what he knew, but he also knew what he didn't know. Right? And the things he didn't know, he left them to the professionals. For example, when it came to the stop at two policy, he left it to the doctors who knew the science behind it to drive the initiative. Even when he was in MAS and GIC, he was more focused on managing people well than diving into all the financial work, which he wasn't trained in. So by doing that, he actually signals to his people that he trusts them to do their work well and he doesn't need to interfere or micromanage. I think that's part of how successful he was in all his different appointments across different sectors, and also why so many of his juniors actually think so highly of him. It's quite a different way of working too. I think our instinct as Singaporeans especially is to worry about everything, to try and keep an eye on everything. But I think Mr. Lee's example shows us that actually empowering people, letting them do their job and trusting them is the way to go.
There's a funny story that one of the interviewees told us about micromanagement and how Mr. Lee was not a micromanager. And this former colleague was Mr. T.K. Pillay. He worked with Mr. Lee at the Ministry of Environment, several departments, I think, including the sewage department. So Mr. Pillay told us that he used to leave work 30 minutes early on Thursdays and Tuesdays to play golf. And one day Mr. Lee found out. And of course, you would expect your boss to scold you, right? If they find out that you were skiving. But on the contrary, Mr. Lee was not upset. He reassured him, saying that, Pillay, I care more about how much a person works and not how much he sits at his desk. So he wanted workers, not seat warmers. And if you could finish your work in less time, wonderful. So we often joke among ourselves that, I think he was a pioneer in work-life balance. But apart from that, I think apart from him not being a micromanager in giving his workers autonomy, one other thing that I felt, I guess, allowed him to be so successful is that he kept very close to the ground. So much like our founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, Mr. Lee Ek Tieng was always on the lookout for things amiss in the environment. And he would carry along with him a recorder and sometimes a tiny 555 notebook. It's called the 55 notebook because there are like 5 fives on the cover. And he would note down what he saw. And this could be an overturned rubbish bin or a clogged drain. And once he got back to the office, he would pass the notes or the recordings to his PA, who would then transcribe or make copies of his notes and then send off the memos to those who were in charge. For someone like us, someone like me working in today's world with the luxury of phone, text messaging apps, it just sounds so tedious. But I think that really shows true dedication to his work, and I think that really is the reason why he managed to do what he did, managed to achieve what he did, and it truly made him a good boss as well as a good leader.